Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to this last session of the Capacity Building Hub for today, the Climate Finance Day. So focusing on building cooperation for scaling climate finance, expanding successful approaches together. So we wanted to start this session by maybe just provide a quick overview of what we heard so far throughout the day on the topic of capacity building and accessing and mobilizing finance. So we have a very quick summary of key points, maybe just to frame what has been discussed and throughout the day, and maybe to this last session just to maybe wrap up everything. So I'll do my best to try to prepare a summary. I think a couple of key messages. One is that money alone is not the solution, I would say. When we're talking about capacity building, even if you have enough money or a lot of money, if you don't have the capacities or the institutional setup, then money remains either unused or not used in the most effective manner. So that's one key message. Of course, climate finance readiness is fundamentally about coordinated systems, strong institutions, and sustained capacity building. Again, the issue of not only building that capacity, but being able to sustain it and retain it over time, both at the institutional individual level. So country-driven long-term capacity building is essential, another one of the key messages. Readiness cannot rely on short-term trainings. Instead, whole-of-government approaches, stable institutional structures, and sustained support are needed to translate NDCs and NAPs in investable programs or projects. Fragmentation remains one of the highest barriers because of this lack of strong coordination between ministries of finance, climate change focal points, and other line ministries. Of course, public development banks play a pivotal role, and in general, public institutions in developing countries play a pivotal role. We heard a lot of also local financial institutions and how they also need capacity building to be able to on the one hand become accredited to multilateral funds and not over-rely on the implementing agencies, but also on to understand the different landscape when it comes to climate finance. Partnership and cross-sector collaboration are also indispensable. As we heard, that when it comes to capacity building for accessing finance, you need to engage a wide range of actors. And it's not only about, I think we heard that several times, it's not about project development, it's about creating a framework where we're looking at only one particular fund, but rather a more holistic approach. And this requires also capacity support. Also, the issue of country ownership, as I mentioned, came across throughout the day, including the involvement of national institutions. There were a lot of discussions about how to engage, for example, national universities, research organizations, so that they can participate in this process in the understanding that they also might need themselves some capacity building or support. The private sector, the role of obviously the engagement of the private sector was also mentioned extensively. But it's the understanding that, or realization that the private sector is not, let me say, a panacea or a solution, or it's one of the elements of the equation when it comes to climate finance, and there might be also elements of capacity building there. So that's just a very general snapshot of what we're discussing this day. And now in this last session, what we want to go a bit into is basically looking at two big clusters of topics. So one is about how do you diagnose or assess capacity gaps, how do you address them, and the second block is how to increase the effectiveness of the capacity building support in the existing landscape. So So please allow me to welcome our distinguished panelists to the stage. So we have Dr. Ashala Abeysinge from the GCF. I've seen a lot of Ashala today, but it's very refreshing to hear the perspective of GCF. And pardon the pronunciation if I don't pronounce correctly your names. Argia Sinya Roy from Asian Development Bank, Amanda McKee, that's easy. Emily Boucham, Nat Global Network, Amanda from the NDC Partnership, sorry, I assume we all know you, and Gregoire Saller from GIZ. So please, all of you, welcome, and a big thanks to all of you, our co-organizers, NAP Global Network, for being with us. And of course, we want to hear from you, but at some point we will also allow questions and comments from the audience. There are not enough chairs, so I cannot sit with you, so I will try to moderate from here. So like I mentioned, we have a first block of discussions, which is the ever important issue of assessing or diagnosing what are the capacity gaps. Of course, we're talking in the context of accessing and mobilizing finance. But once you do this diagnosis or assessment, how do you address them? I think there's a tendency, we've seen that there are a lot of processes for assessing gaps and needs, but sometimes maybe not enough systematic work on how this can be addressed. And that's something that we're doing at the UNFCCC, trying to collect these gaps and needs, at least for creating a platform where we have a collection of these gaps and needs and examples of ways and means how they've been addressed through projects, case studies, etc. So basically, I have a couple of questions for this first block, and no particular order, so please feel free to come in based on your experiences and the work you're currently doing. Sorry. So the first question is, from your experience, what are the really specific technical capacities that are missing when countries try to develop what we call the so-called bankable projects? Some people are not keen on this term. Sometimes it's more about investable projects. But that's what we hear in the UNFCCC. So, and when I make the emphasis on specific technical capacities, because we hear a lot in our process that one of the key capacity gaps and needs is about accessing and mobilizing finance. That's very general. What does that mean? How you unpack that? Is it about accessing a particular fund? Is it a particular understanding of blended finance, etc.? So it would be great to hear from you exactly about that. What are the specific technical capacities missing when countries try to develop these so-called bankable projects? And maybe the second question, just for you to know, is what capacity building approaches actually lead to funded projects? Is it just workshops? Is it dedicated training? So what are the approaches that actually have proven more successful to projects making it all the way? I'll leave it there, so please feel free to come in based on your experience. Who wants to go first?
I can go first.
Yes, thank you, Amanda.
Should I take both questions, Alejandro, or
as you wish?
start?
Yes.
Okay. So, Amanda McKee with the NDC partnership, and we're currently supporting over 100 developing countries to plan, implement, finance their NDCs, and so we've seen at the country level a few sort of common, consistent challenges around capacity needs. I would say the first is kind of high level in terms of the human capacity that exists, and the challenges, the complications in the system, and not having the right people or enough people there to do it. So that's a really important capacity, because it's not about the technical capacities that they're bringing, but it's just the number of people that are there. And I wanted to actually couple that with a solution that we have, because something that we've been doing through the partnership and has worked quite well is we've been embedding advisors in country governments. And we've been doing this for a number of years. We started with what we call an in-country facilitator who plays a role of really connecting the dots. And these facilitators, these advisors, they work on behalf of the country focal points. They report to them, but we pay them. We hire them and we pay them. So they're there for a long period of time. And their role is to really bridge the gap across ministries, across different parts of other parts of the government, and then also importantly with partners. And so they serve as an extra set of hands to ensure that the country is really leading the conversation. They're working under the direction of the focal point. They're also helping to create the processes in country to institutionalize some of that work. So creating intergovernmental or interministerial coordination mechanisms, helping to chair them, but establishing them in a way that it's not just dependent on that individual, but when they leave, this is something that can be carried over, could be easily handed off to someone. What we realized is that there's a lot of technical capacity or a lot of areas where it's a technical field and you need someone with specific expertise to come in. And so we have also been embedding these, putting in place these embedded advisors, particularly on the topic of finance. And a lot of them will play a similar role, but bringing in the right actors from the finance side, or they will be experts who've engaged with the GCF and they understand the technicalities around how to submit a project proposal or the different steps that go into putting that project proposal together. So I just wanted to share that maybe to kick off the conversation as one example, because it really reflects the principle that we have in being country-led. And so it's the country who's telling us what capacity that they need, and we're actually embedding it there as opposed to bringing a consultant in and out just to deliver a one-off package.
I can go next. Okay. I can see you're struggling with your microphone. This one says, I'm with the Jeff. I'm actually, it's a sign actually to say that we all should work together. I'm with the GCF, Green Climate Fund. This is Global Environmental Facility, which I'm not with right now, but you know, it's one of my points is to say that we all actually have to work together. Right now, what we are seeing is so many siloed approaches, and Alejandro was saying that he's seen me several times today, and I'm giving the same message again and again. Let's avoid this siloed approach to really go more, help countries to think more systematically, cohesively, strategically, and use the GCF readiness funding. And I keep saying this. The GCF readiness funding, we have 1.2 billion US dollars. We've already allocated around 750 million US dollars, so a bit more to go up to 2027. And the readiness funding is to access climate finance, full stop. Not access climate finance from GCF. Access to climate finance from all the partners, all the donors, and work with all the partners who are here, GIZ, Global Network, NDC Partnership, ADB, work with everybody. Utilize the GCF readiness funding for that purpose. And the gap that I'm going to come to, you are asking, what is the gap that we are seeing? That's not happening. Right now, it's very siloed, one ministry-led or one individual person-led, really not bringing the whole country together in a whole government approach, and it's very much siloed. So this we are trying to avoid, and we are encouraging countries to think about more systematic, strategic coordination platforms, such as country platforms. And I mentioned in my previous interventions that we've seen now GCF has supported 16 country platform establishments, including 14 that was announced on Saturday. And that this we really hope that it's not going to be another something on paper, but actually countries taking the leadership to be in the driving seat to tell all of us what they really need, to prioritize, and then tell all the implementing agencies, supporting agencies that this is what we really need from you in terms of climate action on the ground. We have the readiness needs assessment. Most of the countries are doing readiness needs assessment utilizing GCF readiness funding, and that I think is an opportunity for all of us to come together and have a look and see what actually the needs are, and bring everybody together to support those needs assessments. Again, those needs assessments have been done in isolation, not necessarily. Now we have NDC 3, we have new national adaptation plans coming in, so there is a need for us to also help countries to have better linkages with all these strategic documents that they are preparing, to put them into actual practice and implement them on the ground. And I've already, I'm going to talk to the NDC partnership and all the other partners in terms of now the submitted NDCs, what else can we do to help them to have proper implementation plans. And this includes bringing private sector on board. And this one, I think, is a massive gap that we are seeing in our countries. Bringing private sector on board, thinking about different financial instruments such as guarantees, equity, and loans. GCF is a high-risk taker when it comes to our funding. We do the first loss guarantees. We help countries to, or organizations to absorb risk through GCF grant funding. But that function of more intentionally bringing private sector for both mitigation and adaptation is not happening enough. It is happening, but it's very small scale, not happening enough. So another thing for us to put our heads together in terms of how do we help countries to come together to think about private sector. Third thing, very quickly, I want to mention, GCF is becoming quite vocal, including through our board mandate, to really think about country ownership through national entities. And I mentioned this several times in my previous interventions, really help the local organizations, national and regional organizations, to be in the driving seats, to use their systems, to also help them to think at scale and speed. What we are hearing when it comes to national organizations is that they are small projects, they are very slow. This needs to be changed, which means bringing our international organizations to support the national organizations to be in the driving seat. This is going to take a bit more time, but it needs to be intentional, and we need to be intentional in helping countries to do that. Thank you.
Thanks, Angela.
Thank you, Emily Beauchamp from the NAPLO Network and IISD. And following up on the mention of embedded advisors and working more together and more planned, I think from the NAPLO Network, we've been working a lot on capacity building, especially with the lens of peer learning. So when you say like being very much country-driven and listening to what countries want, but also listening from other countries that have not just the technical expertise, but also the lived experience. Because when you're in a focal point, or when you're a technical advisor, or in finance, or I work especially in monitoring, evaluation, and learning, then it's the knowledge of kind of like, how do you go through that Excel spreadsheet, and how do you go, how do you organize it with some of your colleagues? That becomes really important in the implementation. Because it's a bit of a tricky thing when you think about learning and capacity building. You do all these activities, and then you kind of expect that the learning is going to happen. So at the NAPLO Network, we think a lot about different types of learning-oriented activities, and what are the enabling factors and the context that needs to happen in order for learning to then be implemented. But what I wanted to talk about a little bit here was basically the peer learning. So we've been doing a lot of South-South cooperation and peer learning, and we have an extensive record there, including on finance and developing, for example, private sector strategies. So we've been working with Vietnam for about 5 years now, and they first were interested in private sector engagement through a peer learning that happened in the Netherlands in 2019. And in 2021, they published a private sector engagement strategy. And now we can see in 2024, 2025, they actually have some outcomes of private sector companies, especially banks, that make preferential loan rates for companies that want to invest in resilient products and services. But you need to create the right mix of awareness and technical work. So I'm just going to throw it to the panel that, for example, we also work through embedded advisors because we find that works very well. But one example, and I'm thinking of a particular SID, Small Island Development State, that the embedded advisor we're supporting is very good, very technical. And then he was saying, Emily, I'm now talking about NAPS and about finance to my other colleagues, and they're looking at me and they're like, oh, okay, I've gone too far in my knowledge, and now I need my colleagues to catch up. So I think things like peer learning and getting the rest of the government to have a whole of government approach to make sure that you want to go in depth, but you can't go in depth with just individuals. And with national adaptation plans, it's a lot about collective learning. So you need to go with a kind of different strategies and mix them, go little by little. Otherwise, you risk losing your knowledge in the learning. But I'd be keen to hear other strategies.
Thank you, and thanks for having us. So, I work in the adaptation space, so I will focus on that. And I think the technical capacity required for adaptation is slightly different from mitigation, actually. But in the adaptation space, I don't think it's possible for a single person to have the all technical skill set required from origination to structuring to getting money. I think that's the first point. You can't expect that, which automatically means a person, if you're Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Water, Ministry of Finance, they have to work with each other to get the right skill set there. Now, within that space, based on our work, I think the three technical skills which we see largely are lacking or are limited rather. One is the skill to articulate the benefits of adaptation. I think it's really lacking. And the way you articulate the benefits to a Ministry of Finance is very different from Ministry of Health to very different from a Ministry of Water maybe, right? Because the investors are looking at the benefits from a different metrics angle. So I think that's one big technical area of work required. The second is, even if you've articulated the benefits, you need to understand where will the money come from. And considering money is not just one source of grant financing or loan or guarantee, So for what type of investment, what type of money is most appropriate? And that requires a lot of capacity, but I would also say a lot of consultation within different ministries to have a common understanding and ownership as a country. And the third bit, I think, I still feel that, I don't like the word climate projects, but nevertheless, specific projects or interventions are mostly still seen as a siloed intervention from regular development intervention. And as a result, the dependability of only having additional money coming in and supporting that expectation still continues. But I think so the third technical capacity is how do you make sure in adaptation case, the adaptation development of investments is very much closely related to government's wider investment planning purposes and how we can build capacity on that. Thanks.
Thank you, and Gregor.
Okay, let me close the circle and try not to be too redundant. Well, first of all, Alejandro, your first key message from today, money alone is not a solution. I would support that, but I would also add to that, without money, there are no solutions. So that is also part of the truth. GIZ is basically a company owned by the German government. We are working in around 100 countries with 25,000 employees, and the majority of those employees are in the countries we are working in. So one of the key messages I also share with my colleagues here is it's really important to be in those countries on the ground. We're also working with embedded advisors, etc., etc. Still, there are quite a number of challenges, even when you have the embedded advisor, that needs to be overcome. Country platforms have been mentioned. I think that is one part of the solution, because it's also a challenge that more or less for every financier, the approach is always a bit, or sometimes also a lot different. In some contexts, that's totally necessary, because we are talking about different sectors, we are talking about different country realities, but still I think there is room to more align also those different needs and approaches from the financiers, and by doing that, it's also a bit easier than to build the capacities, because then it's not the capacity only for that one specific financier, but for a multitude of them. Still, I would argue there is no one-size-fits-all holistic set of tools that can be employed. I mean, adaptation in finance has been mentioned a lot. There is a general sentiment that a lot more needs to be done to leverage private finance for adaptation. And I fully agree with that, but I would also point out that there are limits to that, and there will be always a need, especially in adaptation, for public finance. And to understand that early in the specific project context, I think is super important, to have that analysis. What is actually realistic? What kind of finance is needed? Is important, because then you can get these potential financiers on the table early on. I often see, and I don't exclude GIZ necessarily from that mistake, you do projects for quite some time, and then at some point you think, now we have that great project, that great approach, and now we are at the point where we need financing coming in, and then it turns out that, you should have done this and this and this differently in order to be finance ready, to be investable. And one last point also I think to remember is building capacity, also human capacity. It's not a one-time thing. Because especially, again, in that finance part, there is a challenge if you build the capacities, for example, in ministries. Those people who then have those capacities, this knowledge, are also terribly attractive for other positions. So there is just a very high turnover. So you need to implement an approach where it's not a one-time capacity building, but really a continuous process, because capacities can also get lost again.
Thank you, Gregor, and to all our panelists. I think maybe I won't attempt to summarize, but I think very important points came out. One, that when we're talking about capacity gaps, it's a combination of typology of gaps. It's the technical skills, the very technical skills, but also the, if you wish, soft skills, the coordination, the negotiation skills, even at some point. So, and what Amanda mentioned in terms of the benefit of embedded advisors, I think that's a very important approach, particularly when seeds, because I mean, when you go to a seed, sometimes that person is doing the 3 conventions, for example, but it's not about training him or her. It's just they just need more people in his or her team. So I think the notion of embedded advisors, but it's very good, but still, how do you avoid that over-reliance on that embedded advisor, as you mentioned, that trying to start building that institutional capacity or framework, so that when the embedded advisor at some point will need to go, you cannot finance them indefinitely, then you have installed some capacity. I think another point that mentioned is, it's not about training one people in one line ministry, it's about generating this way of working together within the ministries, and maybe there see what are particular skills or knowledge that need to be transmitted. Also, I think, Emily, you mentioned a very concrete modality, which is peer-to-peer learning, in terms that has shown some success, and I would argue also that in the context of South-South cooperation has also proven valuable. So having said that, so when we talk about this capacity assessment, and I think Shala mentioned it, do you have any thoughts on how we can we or not advance common capacity assessment tools and frameworks For example, using as an example the GCF readiness assessment tool or GIZ that has done this, because we have seen it in the context of the UNFCCC that in the effort to provide a framework for assessing capacities it was very difficult. Very, very difficult. So wanted to hear your views on, or your experiences on this. Should we start, Emily?
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much. I'm gonna leave. I know there's a GIZ and GCF training assessment, so I'll say just a little bit about institutionalizing capacity building. And I think, just off the cuff, it is about mixing these modalities and making an assessment not just of the technical skills, but of the long-term needs. So I think the long-term planning of capacity building is really important. I'll put my monitoring, evaluation, and learning hat on, and been spending a lot of time thinking about how to institutionalize learning. And actually, if we treat learning more as an adaptation activity in itself, it would be much easier to implement and to make it part of, for example, GCF readiness projects and other project proposal. Because at the moment, we're still doing project design and proposal design as these are the activities, these are the trees and the boots and grounds and the seeds that we're going to provide and the beneficiaries. And then we do, we need to do the monitoring and evaluation of what this has done. And then we completely miss the window of how do we learn from this? How do we go from ending the project to revising the next NAP or the next project and whatnot? And we need to start budgeting for this. We need finance for doing the capacity building and doing it in a way that is contextual and really appropriate to the dynamics of countries and of communities. But we also need to budget enough space for this rather than being like, they'll just learn. It's going to be fine. It's not been fine for the past decade. So maybe changing a bit the approach on this would be great. And I'm just saying that other modalities that the NAP network has worked to embed, to institutionalize different actors, I think, working also with civil society, who kind of stays around more sometimes than the rapid role of public service, but also embedding knowledge in institutions like training for civil service and universities as well. So that allows more historical, long-term knowledge and kind of cycles of learning to be put in place. And I would be counterproductive if I wouldn't say, and making accessible free resources like online self-paced course. For example, the NAP network has done a monitoring, evaluation, and learning course that is free, self-paced, and you can learn about what MEL is and how to do it. So check it out.
I'm happy to come in. So I think from our point of view, because we don't have any specific capacity building tool in our own institution, so we're very happy to follow what our client country would like to follow. But I would expect certain level of commitment from their side that if they're using a particular tool, they're committed to it. Because there tend to be a case where different partners comes in with different tools, and clients are also agreeing to different tools. I think there's sort of how commitment is required. And secondly, going to Emily's point, in our institutions, we have very big departments who are for evaluation departments. So we take evaluations of our projects very seriously. But how much of the results of the evaluation feeds back into learning to feed into a future programming, future project is still a very much, I would say, kind of gray area in the adaptation space. So my own advocacy within my institution is, yes, we take evaluation very seriously, but how to capture the resilience learning from it, not at the end of the project. So, for our case, projects can be for a 10 years duration project when it's being implemented, like civil works happening for a flood management wall, right? It's a 10 years thing. But within that 10 years, the risk landscape is completely changing. So how do you continuously learn as you implement so that by the time a next project is coming, that's something can be taken much more seriously? Thank you.
Thanks. So for us, inward looking, we do have a new department of monitoring, evaluation, and learning. That last word, as Emily also mentioned, is extremely crucial. It's just thinking about how do you iteratively learn, and something doesn't really stop. Learning doesn't stop just at the end of a project. So being intentional about that. We do have, our board has approved for us to have regional offices now. So we are going to establish offices in Africa, Latin America and the Caribbean, Pacific, etc. So regional offices, which means we are also going to be closer to our countries. We have readiness funding for dedicated window to embed GCF liaison officers in countries. So these are inward looking, but also helping for us to become closer to our countries, so we understand better in terms of what the countries need. We also have a very strong monitoring and accountability framework. One thing we are now looking at is, instead of our accredited entities being responsible and accountable to GCF, how do we also make sure the accredited entities who are our partners in implementing projects on the ground also accountable to countries? So the capacity strengthening, knowledge transfer, peer-to-peer learning also happens the other way around, not just GCF learning and recording things on paper and not really communicating them to countries. So monitoring and accountability framework is really looking at that, towards that. And we are also revising our country ownership guidelines very soon based on the board mandate. So country ownership guidelines will definitely look at these long-term needs of the GCF as well as our accredited entities to really help countries to be on the driving seat. GCF has already committed 19 billion US dollars. That's B, not M. I have a blocked nose. 19 billion US dollars in our climate finance. 80% of our funding go through our international accredited entities. Only 20% go through our direct access entities. These are national entities, and that's why I was mentioning about the need for us to also work more with our national direct access entities. So what we are now focusing on is to further establish and strengthen the community of practice of direct access entities, so bringing direct access entities together to learn from each other, but also from our international accredited entities, so that they have more capacity to learn from each other. So these are not necessarily tools, but these are the things that we are doing further to help countries and national organizations to build their capacities in a sustaining manner. Thank you.
So I wanted to talk about something that we're actually doing with the GCF, or that we've done with the GCF, because one of the things that we've seen is a lot of the challenges that come up. They come up again and again, and there are solutions. And through the conversations we had with GCF a number of years ago, we realized that when projects were coming to the GCF Secretariat, there was a lot of backwards engineering that was being done. And we had support that we could devote, and there's GCF readiness that can go to help with some of those challenges. And so we actually put together a framework, a climate investment planning and mobilization framework. And the idea with this was not to be prescriptive, not to give a template, but to explain the different elements of the process and the different strategies, resources, opportunities that are available. And so mapping it from investment planning and mobilization capacity, so thinking about the institutional arrangements that are needed, all the way down to giving a template. If you're going to coordinate ministries, here's a process that could work or that you could adapt to your context. The framework looks at identifying and prioritizing investment needs. And so again, looking at some of the particular tools to help to understand how to translate the NDC into the investment needs, but then importantly to prioritize them. And part of that is also making the case for them. What is the climate rationale? All of this is things that capacity can be really impactful to deliver. Next, going into the finance strategy, and then only then do you get into the actual development of project proposals and move them forward to different financing opportunities. So this has been one tool that's been really, really helpful for us. We recently launched an online version of it as well to try to make it a little bit more accessible. So it's not a long, dense document, but I would encourage colleagues to check that out.
Yeah, I think I keep my answer short because I think a lot of right things were said. At GIZ, we also, of course, have our toolboxes, our general, let's say, way to go on also developing project. It's called Capacity Works, but it rather describes the process behind all that. What is important to do? What kind of steps in designing a project? So it's not like a prescriptive toolbox in a sense. I'm always a bit skeptical when I see new tools coming up. I think there are also so many tools already around. So I think it's always important to really see first, is there a need for an additional tool, or is it rather to work with the existing tools and ideally also bring that together. Yeah, maybe I leave it here for now.
Thank you very much. And again, I think very interesting discussions. I take away a couple of messages. And something I think Emily mentioned, of course, the issue about monitoring and learning. I think that's very important, and I think came across very clearly. Also, the issue of yeah, indeed, we don't need common capacity assessment tools. They're context specific, but there should be a systematic way or framework to do the capacity assessment, but also the learning and monitoring to improve, continuously improve. I think something that Emily mentioned that I think is sometimes we missed is the issue that most countries have these institutes for training or capacitating civil servants. And I said usually sometimes they're forgotten because those are institutions that are there in the countries that are supposed to capacitate or train public officials. So this could be an interesting avenue to address the issue of not only building but retaining capacity. No? So I think that's a very important topic. Let's continue. Have two more questions maybe. I'll read them together and you can answer them. This is maybe a tricky one. What's, in your experience, the right sequence of capacity intervention? Is there an optimal capacity building pathway? And then another question is how to balance deep capacity in few countries versus less deep in more countries. So it's about, you don't have, but there are countries that there might be a more advanced, if I can say that, but they need different types of capacities. Again, without forgetting or leaving aside the country ownership aspect. So, who wants to go first?
Maybe let me start now, and
Yes.
I can say hopefully something smart at the beginning. Maybe the second question you've raised, well, my first thought was, well, easy to answer, but on a second thought, I think that it's a fair question to ask. So a few countries and in depth instead of many countries and more light touch approach. Because to be quite honest, funders of course like to have a footprint as large as possible, because then you always report you have done that kind of work in so and so many countries, for example. And while I believe that there is value in that, I think it's extremely important to really put enough resources in specific countries and really build systems, capacities, etc. there decently. And then if over time, you can of course then also use these capacities to bring those experience from those countries directly
Yeah.
in other countries. I think that is a valid approach, but I have to admit that there is pressure also when we design projects where we sometimes have to argue, well, let's rather focus on fewer countries with more resources instead of more countries and then kind of spread the resources. So happy to hear from the other organizations how you're looking at that.
Yeah, I can come in next, and would echo a lot of the similar things that you mentioned. And I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all solution, but I think one principle that applies is that it needs to be a continual process, which we've talked a little bit about. But the needs evolve over time. One approach that we've taken is we've really tried to lean into regional approaches. So bringing together a diversity of actors from across the region to learn from each other, but then ensure that it's targeted enough to the context that they're experiencing. Something that we'll be doing this next year, actually working with the UNFCCC Secretariat, is even smaller group approaches. So bringing 3 or 4 countries together and purposefully trying to bring a mismatch of capacity, because those who have already been through the process can share their lessons, their experience, what worked and what didn't, but they also stand to gain or to learn as others are going through that process now, because the landscape evolves. It's continually evolving, and I think we need to continue to build up our skill sets just like we do as technical providers. I think the last thing that I would mention in terms of the sequencing is, and it's building on your point as well, I think as technical support providers, ensuring that we're thinking about creative ways to build it into the work that we do. So it's not a workshop to kick off the work or a workshop to close it, but what is that mechanism that can kind of build that capacity throughout? And just to give one quick example, I started earlier by talking about these facilitators, embedded advisors. One thing that we've done, and it's been really effective and extremely low cost, is we've created a network amongst those advisors. And they have regional WhatsApp groups that they exchange together, and they ask questions. We have regional kind of online convenings where we talk about some of the work in the region. We have global online convenings where we present some of the new things that we're seeing through the partnership. And then when we have the opportunity and we know that we're in person at particular events, we make it a priority to convene, to come together, to exchange. Because building up that relationship and just having those connections in itself is a really important way to kind of continue with that knowledge exchange.
We still have ministries of finance coming to us asking who's GCF, and there is no, there is no one size fits all, as my colleagues mentioned here. I also don't know what the right sequencing is, but I try to visualize a world where all the government ministries of finance, trade, economic affairs, foreign ministries, ministries of all the line ministries, together with Ministry of Environment to understand what this actually means. And that requires the whole society, whole government thinking. And how do we do that? And we from the GCF side, we cannot say we go deep in one countries and we do less deep in other countries. The GCF readiness funding, $7 million US, are available for all eligible countries. All eligible developing countries, this funding is available. But there are front runners, there are champions, there are not so champions who are actually not utilizing readiness funding. So it's just thinking about who can lead the way to show the way to the other countries. And one of the reasons why I mentioned the country platforms approach was because some countries are now taking the lead to bring all the countries together, all the government and other stakeholders together to show that there is a cohesive, systematic way of doing this. And Brazil is one example that utilized GCF readiness funding to establish their country platform. Only a year ago, we approved the readiness project for Brazil. They now have a 22 billion US dollar pipeline already. And they are talking to different investors and different partners to say who's going to do what. Caribbean, 7 countries together, because the Caribbean countries are small, led by Her Excellency Mia Motley of Barbados, brought 7 countries together and established a Caribbean regional platform to again bring the investors on board for their resilience, their debt swaps, and many other things to really focus on long-term climate vision, but bringing everybody together in their governments to build their capacity so they speak in one voice when it comes to climate investment. So this is happening. Again, as I mentioned, it's a bit slow, but it is happening. So bringing everybody together, the sequencing I don't know, but please use the GCF readiness funding to really think cohesively how you can do it, and when we count on partners who are here to do that. Thank you.
Thanks. Apologies, I've got to leave for another panel. Just to highlight a couple of things. For me, I don't think there's any sequence. The sequence has to be defined by the country, what makes sense for them, right? Because different countries at different stages. That's number one. Number two is, I think we're talking about countries, we mean governments. There's also a lot of, I think the capacity within the private sector is also very limited. They sometimes don't express it, but it's not that they understand it that well always. If they would have understood it, I would have assumed they would have done it already, right? So there is a lot of gap there. And thirdly, I think for institutions like ours, which are member state-driven institutions, I don't think capacity building could be projectized. It has to be a continuous effort in, as you rightly said, embedded in government systems and hopefully national capacity building institutions itself, and a continuous support to them as and when it required, depending on their demands. So thank you, and thanks for leaving. Thank you so much.
Thank you for making the time, and thank you very much.
I'll jump on that to say, in terms of, it can't be projectized, it needs to be embedded, it needs to be institutionalized, and one of the approaches also that we've been encouraging is to have, just like in GCF and other organizations, there's the Department of MEL. Where does that sit in the country? Does that just sit in M&E officers that are, in the Ministry of Environment or whatnot? What we see in some countries, there's, for example, I'm thinking especially about, no, I'm going to say the wrong country. But I'm thinking of an African country which has a president office and actually has a department for monitoring evaluation as part of the president's office that's overseeing the other monitoring evaluation offices across departments. That's also where the auditing functions are set. Thank you. And so it's just like, how do you embed capacity building in terms of references so that it stays institutionalized? And then that way it can be financed, just not through projects, because we know what happens with projects when they end, but it could keep on going as part of the rules of the government. I will also support highly the responses on platforms. I think that's the cleverest way to make sure that you don't duplicate. That would entail as well platforms for us folks who are supporting countries to collaborate as well, because we also know what happens. We also work in silos. We really like exchanging, like here, so thank you so much for inviting, but also, we need to finance also our time to make sure that we coordinate on capacity building and we don't produce the same trainings and activities.
Thank you so much, Emily, and everyone. This is very, very rich discussions. I think a lot of key messages. One, I think, is that there is no right or wrong sequence. I think it's rather not go back to an old mindset, no? That you need to do an assessment, then you need to develop a workshop, then you need to bring. It might work in some contexts, but in others not. So you have to think of it from a different perspective through the platforms and through national institutions. And I think you made an important point. What we call in the UNFCCC, in the context of the PCCB, the coherence and coordination of capacity building activities, which means at country level, but also at the support level, no? And I think we have very good examples of collaboration here, for example, with NDC Partnership and GCF. So I'll stop here, but I would like to give now the audience the opportunity to ask questions. I already see a hand there in the back. You have a microphone, Julia? Okay.
Thank you for sharing your experiences and your work. I'm curious, you'll mention about different capacity building programs that you all have executed. GIZ, of course, supports governments, but you also support private sector on many occasions. Is it reasonable to expect that someday there will be a platform where we can transparently see GIZ supporting in Bangladesh, Pakistan, Cambodia, Vietnam, these respective ministries on this particular topic from this date to this date? And in these countries, providing capacity building for these 200 manufacturers, SMEs, on these particular topics, so that other capacity building organizations be able to see, and also the private sector be able to see, and maybe then feel, oh, maybe the implementation risk can be lower if I go with one of those manufacturers that have received capacity building. Maybe I will go into this market because the universities and the governments have been trained, so I am a small niche impact finance fund. I know that infrastructure exists there, that foreign currency and other aspects of getting money in will work out. Is that reasonable to expect to have something like that? Thanks.
Maybe just from our side, I mean, from the UCCC, there are attempts to try to do that, but it's quite a huge endeavor, I have to say. Such a platform that's worldwide, I mean, I think it might be a big challenge from our perspective, but I would like to hear from colleagues.
I think there are a lot of information, not everything, but a lot of information that you have raised here is actually available, but it's scattered in different places. But here, I guess maybe technology will also be a big enabler. I mean, talking about artificial intelligence, that's one of the things they already, to some extent, can do quite well. I mean, you have the time lag in most models at the moment, but I think that will change in the future. So there, it's also a bit the question where we invest the resources. Is that something, for example, if that specific need to build, let's say, an information platform to collect all that data, is that something that will still be a need in 2 or 3 years? Or will there be technology solutions that will do that quite easily for us? I don't have the answer, but I think that is something we need to be aware of, because we also need to understand, I mean, we are here at the COP and we are talking a lot about great progress, but at least the reality in many countries, in many donor countries, is also that the funding is rather going down. So we have to think even more smartly than we, of course, have already done in the past, how to invest that, rather getting more limited resources. So long story short, I think in some countries there is very good information. For example, in India, there's also like the government having a system where also all development providers need to report, and then they also collect a lot of information. And a lot of information is out there, but I think the challenge is that it's scattered. There is not that one basic resource that you can tap into and tell you all. And especially when we are talking about private sector, it's also often a bit the challenge in those support measures, depending a bit on what. On the one hand, it can be a bit of actually something they like to advertise with. They have received support, for example, from GIZ, and that makes them more attractive in a certain extent to financiers, for example. But often there are also concerns about business secrets. So it's also sometimes not so easy from a data privacy point of view, how, let's say, deep you can get in this.
No, I think that's an important point, because what we can offer from the UNFCCC perspective is a capacity building portal. And that's an attempt to collect a lot of resources on capacity building that are out there in one single platform, training courses, learning modules, podcasts, but it goes to a level, it doesn't go to the level of detail you indicate. And I think that's an issue. I mean, what we have in the CCC, it's a lot of courses, learning, success stories, but again, it might not go to that level of detail, as you say, that an SME would find something specific on that. So I think it goes back to your point. There might be a lot of information. We try to pull it together, but still, for particular needs, there's still not everything is there. But yeah, the opportunities of AI, what it offers, it could be very interesting. How can that shape that? Anyone wants to respond to that? If not, we move to the next question.
So, hello everyone. So, and thank you for this panel. And so I'll just ask questions.
Can you please introduce yourself?
Yes. So my name is Lingqing Liu, and I'm currently studying in Columbia University for a sustained management program. And formerly, I was intern in consultancies in UNCCD and UNESCO UNIVOC. And this question is quite related to my internship experience in UNESCO UNIVOC, because I was a knowledge exchange and knowledge support while I was doing intern in UNESCO UNIVOC. And a lot of my work is actually promoting the vocational educational training for the people globally and locally, and especially on the green transition, I would say, in climate change, in environmental problem, and right now, for example, in migration, in technology, in especially these few fields. As also, we also requires a lot of funding, let's say from different stakeholder and parties, like GIZ. And so one of the project we have is called Build. And this Build is actually a platform for around to try to build up capacity building coalitions from around the world to education institution. And while I was doing that in past, they are holding successful events in, for example, in Africa and Philippines, across Pacific Ocean, everywhere. So my question would be that, because right now what is my experience only, that there is, I think, an information gap and also a gap in terms of climate finance, which is the topic we're discussing today. Because while we're doing a lot of event and bridging, it occurs that implementation, and we have implementation, and we even have scientists, policy makers, very detailed strategies, and it's all being planned down. But in terms of financial investment, especially in the field of green transition, there appear to be a gap. And then also there's sometimes events have to be cut off because there's not enough finance that input into these fields. And so I really want to ask questions, because I think it's a question that's very practical, or I would say that is actually very, very deep in the reality of the scope. We have a plan right now, but how can we actually very underground, I would say, carry out all our strategy, our plan, our framework, and to actually try to solve the problem, especially that's, coming from, I would say a lot of low development country and people in Global South, they actually lack that financial base. And how can we actually implement, our common funding into this area, and how empower these people, those that are less vulnerable? Thank you. That's my questions.
Thank you. Anyone any from our panel would like to address that?
That's a very broad question. I think we all have different roles to play in trying to answer that question. From our side, what we do is we bring finance to the countries that are very vulnerable to climate change. All developing countries have access to GCF funding. Funding is one of the main barriers for climate action on the ground. So GCF, established under the UNFCCC, is trying to address that one of the main barriers that I mentioned. In terms of bringing funding to where it matters, the local communities that you're talking about, we have a special program called Locally Led Climate Action. So, and that one is, again, us being intentional to try to bring our funding to the local communities. Two areas that we prioritize in terms of our work is utilizing grant funding that we have to mobilize private capital, so helping countries to catalyze private sector, through that create jobs, bring more innovation. And the other side is vulnerability through locally led climate action, balance 50-50 adaptation finance, and through many other instruments that we have, including focusing on direct access entities, as I mentioned before. That's a broad answer to your very broad question, but happy to have another discussion if needed. Thank you.
So the one thing I would complement that is exactly as Achala was saying, you know, we all bring different perspectives and I think different elements to this, and through the NDC partnership, it's helping countries think through what are the priorities and how to surface them and ensure that focal points are working across ministries to surface those needs so that the funding is going to the parts where it's most needed. And then working with partners like those that are on the panel today to ensure that the right people are coming to the table and working together to deliver that finance.
I'll add very similarly, the NAB Global Network is also doing similar but different functions with a focus on national adaptation plans. And that means not just at the national level, but also how adaptation priorities are getting decentralized, or local priorities are also getting brought up into national plans. I think the main, I had a great idea and then I forgot it, I'm very sorry. I think the main point is making sure that, so yeah, coordination and coherence. And one thing we always try to do is mainstreaming. When you think about adaptation, you want to think about mainstreaming how climate risks are integrated into different policies. At the moment, national adaptation plans, NDCs, etc., long-term strategies, they're all different instruments. But what we really want to have, ultimately, is a central strategy with a lot of coordination about what does it mean to have development at different, sustainable and resilient development at different timescales, and arguably at different climate scenarios, because we know this is not predictable, or not accurately predictable. So I think as long as we continue to review the risks and integrate them, and also whose risks, so make sure that it's inclusive, then we can help those who are the most vulnerable. Not just help, but empower.
Thank you very much. Anyone else from the panel? Okay, I think we're coming to the end of the session. If there's no any other question, I think we can. Maybe I'll ask my team, for those interested, if you could put the link to the capacity building portal in a slide, and we can show it maybe under the title of the session, for those that are interested. And if not, then again, just a huge word of thanks to our great panel. Thank you so much. You gave us a lot of good insights, practical insights, so it's really appreciated. And thank you to our audience. And now we'll pass to the panel picture and then to the closing of the day of the hub. So please join me in a picture.